As we begin our exploration into American law, we're going to start by looking at law in general and then dive into our first unit, which will be constitutional law. So let's start by taking a look at American law in general. The thing about law in the United States is that it really affects every piece of our lives. It's that prevalent in society. Simply going to school. Schools are highly regulated by laws. Driving on the road. In order to get your driver's license, you need to go to the Secretary of State, which came about through laws. In order to own a home, you need to pay property taxes because of laws. Some people even argue that we've reached a state of hyperlexis, which means there are basically too many laws and too many lawyers for our society. We really see law is rooted in history. Even when the Pilgrims came over on the Mayflower, then they signed the Mayflower Compact, which was a legally binding agreement between all of them. Our legal society has become highly complex. So complex that even lawyers need to specialize in one specific area of law in order to be able to practice their legal expertise well. It's almost like this guy in this picture right here trying to decide from his many suits. That's what lawyers are like when they need to decide which sector of law should they go into. Should they specialize in business law, tort law, contract law? There are so many different choices, it's almost hard to choose. Hence, many people arguing that we've reached a state of hyperlexis. When examining law, it's almost impossible to do so without coming at it from a particular perspective. So for this course, the legal perspective we're going to be taking will be that of Feynman, the course textbook author. His first major tenet is that law is not in the law books necessarily. There aren't like piles of books covered in dust in third-floor basements of libraries that teach people how to find loopholes in their taxes. Law is, in essence, living. It's something that is carried out through lawyers and through the courts on a daily basis. It doesn't exist in these secret law books. And on that note, we see that law is not necessarily secret. It can be known by your average people, as we will examine in this course. Of course, it may seem that lawyers and judges and people try to keep law secret from the average person, but that simply isn't the case because there are so many resources, especially nowadays with the internet and databases, that the average person is able to access. The next major piece of Feynman's philosophy is that there are really no simple answers to legal questions. That goes hand in hand with his fourth tenet, which is that law is a background of political conflict. In every legal decision, there are warring parties who see things in different lights, and the way they address the political questions brought about by law is different, which makes the legal process extremely more complex. This leads us to his fifth tenet, which is that people are the ones who make the laws. For instance, one scenario that illustrates this really well is there's no cop that's going to pull you over for going 1 mile per hour over the speed limit. And if he does, when you take your ticket to court to challenge it, the judge will laugh and send you on your way, because even though the speed limit might say 55, no judge is going to make you pay a speeding ticket for going 56. Because people make the law. It's not as black and white as it may seem. Now that we know a little bit about American law in general, let's dive into our first unit of constitutional law. In a nutshell, constitutional law is the interpretation and application of the U.S. Constitution. What that means is we have this document, and this document can be interpreted in multiple different ways due to its brevity and simplicity. So the way that we interpret this document is the main subject of constitutional law. due to the multiple ways it can be interpreted. And the way we apply these different interpretations adds tremendous complexity to the area of constitutional law. So, in order to elaborate a bit and look at constitutional law in a few different nutshells rather than just the one of the main things that the Constitution does is it establishes 3 different branches of government, and it determines the roles of each of these. It also outlines the federal system of the United States of America, and we'll dive into that more in this lesson and the coming lessons. And lastly, the United States Constitution installed protections for individuals and the states in our country. What this means is that the Constitution outlined different ways that the federal government cannot impose on specific rights and privileges granted to individual people and states in our nation. So one major function of the Constitution is that it divides our nation into 3 branches: the legislative, executive, and judicial branches. Another major function of the Constitution is that it established the federal system. What this means is that it gave different powers to the national government and the state governments, and the way this federalism works actually has changed over time for more of a layer cake federalism, as it's called, where the national government and state governments exist within different specific spheres. There's no intermixing within the powers that they hold, to a more in the present day, a marble cake federalism, where the national government and the state government have their own kind of broad areas of influence, but these interact more and they're more involved in both areas. Constitutional law is different from many other areas of law, like criminal proceedings or civil litigation, tort law, all of those different things, in one way because it is supreme to all these other areas of law. When I say supreme, I don't mean this kind of supreme, rather this kind of supreme, where the Constitution is greater than all other laws passed in our nation. So every year when the legislative branch passes the federal budget, it is inferior to the Constitution. If our national or state governments pass laws regarding the protection of our roads, they are inferior to the Constitution because the Constitution is superior to all these forms of laws. Another way the Constitution differs from other types of laws is that it's really only centered around one main source text, being the Constitution. There aren't, for instance, Old English precedents they can base their constitutional decisions off. It's simply the Constitution that's the center of all constitutional law debates, hence the name constitutional law. And because the Constitution is supreme to all other areas of law, and it's only centered around one relatively short text, the questions constitutional law addresses are very important to the citizens living within the United States. Constitutional law addresses things like what's acceptable for us as individuals to wear, to say, to do, how should we act. These are significant questions within the lives of everyone in this nation. Due to the importance of the constitutional law process, it's also questioned constantly. For instance, the fact that Supreme Court justices are appointed for life. People often question this practice. So I hope through this first lesson you've learned a little bit about American law in general, and then you've been exposed to the basic ideas of constitutional law, what it is, some of the things that it does, some of the ways it varies from other types of American law.